Do something useful. That's what the man had said, and young Alexander Graham Bell thought it was a good suggestion. But what could he do that was useful? All day Alexander had been playing with his friend Ben Herdman at the Herdman Mill in the countryside of Scotland. They'd had several rousing games of tag, they'd climbed up ladders and jumped off storage bins, and they'd looked for beetles and mice in the fields. Now they were having a race through the mill when Ben's father, who was grinding wheat into flour, finally lost his patience. "Do something useful," he scolded. "Like what?" the boys asked. Mr. Herdman held up a handful of wheat. "Like taking the husks off this wheat," he said. Alexander looked at the wheat, thought about it a moment, and came up with an idea. They could scrape the husks off with a nail brush. So together he and Ben sat themselves down with 2 nail brushes and began scraping. It worked. It worked very well, but it took forever. There's got to be a faster way, thought Alexander. Later, when he and Ben were wandering around the mill again, Alexander noticed a machine with rotating paddles that was no longer in use. What would happen, he wondered, if the paddles were lined with brushes or something else abrasive? Wouldn't they be able to scrape off the husks? Excited, the boys rushed to Ben's father and described their idea. The miller, partly to encourage their creativity, decided to give it a try, and sure enough, the simple machine quickly and efficiently separated the husk from the wheat. It was Alexander Graham Bell's first invention. There would be many more inventions before he was through, including instruments for the deaf and hearing impaired, the hydrofoil, and his most famous invention of all, the telephone. Do something useful was a commandment he lived up to for his entire life. Alexander Graham Bell was born March 3rd in the year 1847, the same year his fellow inventor Thomas Edison was born. The generation to which Bell and Edison belonged was a remarkable generation, full of bold entrepreneurs and creative geniuses. They would help usher in the technological age that would eventually change the daily life of almost every person on Earth. In the first 50 years after Bell was born, inventors and scientists discovered, among many other things, the sewing machine, the hypodermic syringe, electric light, the battery, the gas burner, pasteurization, the oil pipeline, dynamite, torpedoes, the bicycle, the typewriter, insulin, the phonograph, the microphone, celluloid film, radio waves, the pneumatic tire, antitoxins, the internal combustion engine, the automobile, X-rays, and the motion picture camera. Almost every year between 1850 and 1900, there was some dramatic discovery that further shifted us from the agricultural society we once knew to the industrial society we know today. It was exactly the right time for a boy and a man who wanted to do something useful. Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and was christened simply Alexander Bell. He adopted the name Graham from a family friend when he was 11, to distinguish himself from other Alexander Bells in his family tree. It was a distinguished family tree, filled with scholars, artists, and relatives dedicated to education and service. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was an expert and author in the field of speech and deafness, who taught deaf mutes to speak. He had created a technique called visible speech, a code of symbols that indicated the position of the throat, tongue, and lips in making sound. The deaf used these symbols in learning to reproduce speech. Alexander's grandfather was also an expert in speech, with a focus on drama. He was an actor, and later in life gave dramatic readings of Shakespeare. Bell's mother, Eliza Simmons, who was deaf, was a superb portrait painter, and in spite of her disability, a skilled pianist. Bell had 2 brothers, an older one named Melville, or Melly for short, who was especially charming and outgoing, and a younger one named Edward. Alexander, in the middle, was more shy and reserved. He spent long hours by himself, reading or exploring the countryside. His particular talent was music. He played by ear when he was just a toddler, and later he could sight read. He was so talented at the piano that he was given lessons by a renowned master from Edinburgh. For a while, everyone was quite sure that when Alexander Bell grew up, he would be a famous musician. The famous part, they were right about. The most important time of Alexander Bell's youth may have been the year he spent in London living with his grandfather. They shared the same name, the same birthday, and the same determined personality. Grandfather Bell knew of Alexander's low grades in school, and he also worried about his position as middle child. An insightful and compassionate man, he decided Alexander could use a year of special, undivided attention. In that year of special attention, Alexander blossomed from an unsure teenager into a confident and competent young man. Alexander and his grandfather read Shakespeare's plays together, memorizing and performing certain parts. His grandfather gave him lessons in elocution and delivery that had such a long-lasting effect that even late in life, people commented on Alexander Bell's distinct and compelling speech patterns. His grandfather also played piano with him, took him to plays, taught him how to write plays, and instructed him in the science of acoustics and sound, the special field of the Bell family. Alexander wrote a poem for his grandfather that read, "I am 13 years old, I find. Your birthday and mine are the same. I want to inherit your mind as well as your much-honored name." Alexander left his grandfather's house and returned home with a deep respect for the human faculty of speech and ability to communicate ideas, a respect that would be the basis for his life's work. In 1862, when he was only 15, Alexander and his brothers began to assist their father when he gave public demonstrations of his visible speech method. Alexander also enrolled as a student teacher in a boys' school near Edinburgh, where he taught music and speech in exchange for other lessons. He was younger than many of his students. After a few years of university study, Bell became a full-time teacher and also taught visible speech to a class of deaf children. In 1866, when Alexander was 19, he carried out a series of experiments to determine how vowel sounds are produced by the human voice. He read a book on acoustics by the German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz, who was using electrically powered tuning forks to make vowel sounds. He began to wonder about the idea of what he called telegraphing speech. It was the start of an interest in electricity and sound that would persist for many years and would eventually lead to his greatest invention. A few years after his mind had been sparked by this promising idea of telegraphing sound, Bell became his father's partner in London. While he worked with his father, he also taught at the University of London as a specialist in the anatomy of speech. So far, life for Alexander had been simple and almost predictable. But beginning in 1867, when he was 20, things began to change. Alexander was away on a teaching engagement when he received news his younger brother Edward was sick with consumption, a lung disease we know today as tuberculosis. People knew little about tuberculosis in those days, and most blamed it on the cold, damp climate of England and its smoke-filled cities. They had no medicines to treat it and usually just watched in despair as the patient grew weaker and paler and the cough became deeper and more frequent. Alexander rushed home in time to see his brother, but Edward died shortly after. In his diary, Alexander wrote, "Edward died this morning at 10 minutes to 4 o'clock. He was only 18 years and 8 months old. He literally fell asleep. He died without consciousness and without pain while he was asleep. So may I die." Less than 2 years later, Alexander was again rushing home in response to an urgent letter. This time it was his older brother Melly, the dynamic one, the cheerful one, who always made people laugh. He, too, had tuberculosis. By the time Alexander arrived, Melly was already near death. Alexander said his goodbyes, and Melly took his last breath. As children, Alexander and Melly had made a pact. Whoever died first would try to communicate with the living one, if it could be done. Alexander made several attempts to reach his brother after he died. He held little seances in his room at night all by himself, trying to hear Melly and trying to talk to him. He was not successful. For Alexander Graham Bell, the art of communication was destined to be fulfilled on the earthly plane. Now Mr. and Mrs. Bell were frightened. Left with only one son, and he himself prone to illness, they decided to leave Great Britain for a land with a healthier climate. During his travels, Melville Bell had become convinced that Ontario, Canada was their best choice, and so in 1870 he gave up his successful career in London and made plans to relocate to Brantford, Ontario. Alexander Bell, then 23, had no desire to move to Canada. He'd been struggling for many months to attain some sort of independence from his family and especially from his father. Melville Bell was a brilliant man, but he could be domineering and often critical of his son. Alexander announced he was staying behind in London to pursue his own work. But when he saw the despair on his parents' faces, he relented. After all, they'd already lost 2 sons. He simply couldn't find it within his heart to deprive them of another. Alexander Bell was a stubborn and determined man, just like his father, but he was also a man of deep compassion. After they were settled in Canada, Melville Bell was offered a post teaching visible speech to the instructors at a school for the deaf in Boston. He was already committed, so he recommended Alexander instead. Alexander packed his bags and headed for Boston, where he would remain for 9 years. In Boston, Bell opened a school for teachers of the deaf and became a professor at Boston University. He wrote at that time, "My feelings and sympathies are every day more and more aroused. It makes my heart ache to see the difficulties the little deaf children have to contend with." Bell set out to prove to the world that the deaf could be taught to speak. He did. His results were so astounding that he was soon deluged with invitations to lecture and demonstrate his methods. He made many friends in Boston, and he also made contacts, important contacts. One of them was a man named Gardner Hubbard. Bell met Hubbard through his work with Hubbard's daughter, Mabel, a young woman who became deaf at age 5 from scarlet fever. Hubbard was a critic of the Western Union Telegraph Company, and he became intrigued by Bell's work on improving the telegraph. He offered Bell financial backing in hopes his experiments would lead to a system that could compete with Western Union. It was exactly what Bell needed, a patron. Bell's experiments in these days had little to do with trying to transmit speech electrically. Instead, he was trying to find a way to send several telegraph messages over one wire at the same time, a device he called a harmonic telegraph. But a few years into his experiments, he became more and more enthralled by the possibility of an entirely new instrument, one that could carry messages back and forth by voice. He had no idea how to make such an instrument, but in his heart he felt sure it was possible. He continued his telegraph experiments as promised to Hubbard, but always in the back of his mind was this vision of an instrument that talked. As the experiments progressed, Bell found he was short on 2 important resources. One was time, and the other was skill. He was good at concept, but when it came to the details of actually making the parts, he was the first to admit that he was almost completely inept. Hubbard, impatient to see results, insisted that Bell find help. He sent him to a shop that made electrical instruments, sure that he could find some sort of expert who could advise him. Bell found more than an expert. He found a man that would help him form one of the most famous partnerships in the history of science and invention, Thomas Watson. Later, the name Watson would always evoke the very moment the telephone was born, when Bell's first words over the new invention were to call to him for help. Watson and Bell hit it off immediately and became fast friends. Watson rather liked the eccentric figure of Bell, whom he described as tall, slender, quick-motioned, with a pale face, black side whiskers and drooping mustache, big nose and high, sloping forehead, crowned with bushy black hair. To compensate for these early days of work, when the hours were long and grueling and the rewards were minimal, Bell later gave Watson shares in his patent. But Watson's gratitude to Bell extended way beyond material reward. He commented later, "The best thing Bell did for me, spiritually, was to emphasize my love for the music of the speaking voice." Over the next years, Bell continued to teach the deaf and lecture about visible speech. He worked on his improvements to the telegraph system, and he struggled to find the means to create the telephone. He even borrowed a human ear from the Harvard Medical School so he could observe how sound waves affect its membranes. They were exhausting years, described in more detail a little later in this session. With all these pressures and responsibilities, Bell also found time to fall in love, head over heels in love. The object of his affections was Mabel Hubbard, the deaf girl who was the daughter of his financial backer. Mabel hadn't exactly been swept off her feet when she met Bell. She said later, "He was tall and dark, with jet-black hair and eyes, but dressed badly and carelessly in an old-fashioned suit of black broadcloth, making his hair look shiny, and altogether, to one accustomed to the dainty neatness of Harvard students, he seemed hardly a gentleman." But Mabel had remained Alexander's student, and over the months they had developed a deep affection for each other. She began to admire his gentle and encouraging manner, and he, ever the connoisseur of sound, was especially partial to the sweet, melodious tones of her voice. They began to go on outings together, and Bell began to realize that he had found the woman he wanted to marry. Mabel, however, was only 17, and her parents asked Bell to keep his feelings secret for one more year. He plunged himself into his work in an attempt to take his mind off Mabel, but it was an attempt that failed. Unable to work, unable to sleep, he finally wrote to Mabel in Nantucket, where she was spending the summer, and told her how he felt. When Mabel's mother found out, she began to realize the intensity of Bell's feelings, and finally she relented. She put the decision in the hands of her daughter. The mother was won over, and now Alexander had to convince the father, and the father was already annoyed with him. Hubbard was growing more and more irritated with the time Alexander's teaching took away from his work on the telegraph. He gave Alexander an ultimatum: give up teaching or give up my daughter, and give up my backing on the telegraph. Alexander was enraged. He told Hubbard he was dedicated to the profession of teaching, that the deaf children needed him, and that furthermore it was unjust to go back on an agreement. That's the way matters stood on Thanksgiving Day, 1875, which was also Mabel's 18th birthday. Alexander put his pride aside to call at the Hubbard home and wish her a happy birthday, and it was then that Mabel Hubbard showed her true spirit. Mabel confronted her father. She told him she loved Alexander, and from this moment on she considered herself engaged to him. If Hubbard cut off his support of Alexander, he was cutting off his own daughter. Not long after, Mabel received a letter from Melville Bell, Alexander's father, about her upcoming marriage. It read in part, "Alexander is a good fellow, and I have no doubt will make an excellent husband. He is hot-headed but warm-hearted, sentimental, dreamy, and self-absorbed, but sincere and unselfish. He is ambitious to a fault, and is apt to let enthusiasm run away with his judgment." All in all, Mabel Hubbard felt she was getting a good deal. The engagement became official. The work on the telegraph was completed. It did what it was supposed to do, but there were frequent breakdowns in the system, and it soon became clear it wasn't commercially viable. Bell and Watson now focused their full attention on using the principles of the harmonic telegraph to complete work on the telephone. The magnificent instrument was completed in 1876, and Bell decided to demonstrate his masterpiece at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia that summer. He sat there an entire day while thousands of people walked by, completely uninterested. Disheartened but not discouraged, he returned the next day. Again, no one was interested. Finally, at the end of the day, the Emperor of Brazil strolled in, his retinue behind him, and the strangely shaped instrument with the many wires caught his royal eye. The Emperor asked for a demonstration, and was delighted by what he heard. Then he left. Months passed, and Bell couldn't seem to convince anybody that his telephone was more than just a novelty. Bell and Hubbard even offered Western Union full rights to the telephone for only $100,000, so desperate had they become for cash. The president of Western Union rejected the offer, saying he saw no reason to waste money on a passing fad. Finally, Bell came up with his own plan. He would give demonstrations of it everywhere he could until somebody, somewhere, realized its potential. Bell launched his own publicity campaign, inviting journalists, scientists, investors, and business leaders to every demonstration. At last, the idea caught fire. People began to order telephones, and in July of 1877, the Bell Telephone Company was formed to meet the demand. One of the first people to order the new telephone was writer Mark Twain. In characteristic style, he quipped to the installers, "If Bell had invented a muffler or a gag, he would have done a real service." 2 days after the Bell Company was formed, Bell married Mabel Hubbard. The marriage would last a happy 35 years and would produce 2 daughters, Elsie and Daisy. Bell was devoted to his children, but sometimes gave more attention to his work and to others more needy than his family. The children and Mabel occasionally made mild complaints about the time he spent away from them, and at such times he'd admit his error, apologize for his selfishness, and try to reform. For their honeymoon, the Bells traveled to Niagara Falls and then on to England to introduce the telephone to his native continent. They returned home the following year and moved to Washington, D.C. Bell didn't take an active role in the telephone business, but he had no choice but to take an active role in the courts. After the telephone became successful, there were endless lawsuits, as many as 600, filed by people who said they'd invented the instrument first. The most serious complaint was from inventor Elisha Gray, who'd been working on the same idea simultaneously to and independent of Bell. His suit, and several others, made it all the way to the Supreme Court. In every case, Bell won. There were still refinements to be made on the telephone, and Bell worked on those and other inventions in his lab late at night, sometimes after a full day of teaching. He often worked through the night altogether, and then slept through the mornings. Late-night hours were a habit with Bell throughout his life. This was a constant frustration to Mabel, who felt Bell's schedule made him tired and nervous. She tried to get him to switch to more normal hours, but he resisted, saying his best ideas came to him late at night. Eventually, Mabel accepted that she would never change him. She once told him she was going to paint his portrait, and when she did, it was a picture of a white owl. The telephone had been a product of Bell's youthful genius. He lived 45 more years after it was invented, and although those years produced nothing as famous, they were productive and energetic years. Bell dedicated the second half of his life primarily to the service of the deaf. He had made himself useful to those who could hear. Now he would make himself useful to those who could not. When he was 33, Bell received an honorary award from the French government of 50,000 francs. He promptly put the money into the establishment of the Volta Laboratory for Research, Invention, and Work for the Deaf. In that lab, he developed the method of making phonograph records on wax discs. Proceeds from this work, too, were channeled into work for the deaf, this time by establishing the Volta Bureau, which today is an international information center for education of the deaf. The groundbreaking ceremonies of the Volta Bureau were attended by Bell's 13-year-old prodigy, Helen Keller. Helen Keller was a lifelong friend and deep admirer of Alexander Bell. She was particularly grateful to Bell for introducing her to her teacher, Annie Sullivan, known to movie fans as the Miracle Worker. Keller dedicated her autobiography to Bell and wrote a passage that read, "I at once felt the tenderness and sympathy which endeared Dr. Bell to so many hearts. He understood my signs. I knew it and loved him at once." When he was 43, Bell established and financed the American Association to promote the teaching of speech to the deaf, now known as the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf. He also invented the audiometer, an early form of the hearing aid. As if all this wasn't enough, Alexander Graham Bell also made valuable contributions to various scientific organizations. He helped found the eminent magazine Science, and he was president of the National Geographic Society for 6 years. It was he who came up with the idea for the popular National Geographic magazine, still one of America's favorite publications. He suggested the society publish a magazine that was bright, colorful, non-technical, and full of interesting maps and dynamic pictures, a guideline the Geographic follows to this day. and finally Bell accepted a position as regent of the Smithsonian Institution. Bell became an American citizen when he was 35, an achievement he took almost as much pride in as his work. He once said to his daughter, "You were born an American citizen, but I chose to be one." Then in 1884, a national tragedy turned Bell's attention temporarily in another direction. President Garfield was shot by an assassin, and there was a desperate struggle to save his life. Bell quickly developed an electrical apparatus he thought would locate the bullets in the president's body so they could be surgically removed. The experiment didn't work, mainly because the instrument was thrown off by a steel spring in the president's bed. But after the president died of infection, Bell perfected an electric probe, which was used in surgery for several years until the X-ray was discovered. Bell continued with his work for the deaf and also continued to experiment and invent, right up to his 70s. He said, "An inventor can no more help inventing than he can help thinking or breathing." He spent most of his later years at his summer estate on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. He spent his days there playing Scottish folk tunes on his piano and working in his study. He could be irritable when his work was disturbed, and for that reason he never allowed one of those distracting telephones in his study. At night he liked to stay up late, as always, sometimes playing Beethoven on the piano and sometimes reading from the encyclopedia to relax. Bell kept journals about his experiments and ideas, journals that vividly reflect his mental energy. There are dozens of notes and memos, questions and ideas he intended to investigate. Thoughts jotted in the margin that seemed to have nothing to do with the rest of the page, and overall a sense of tremendous curiosity and ambition. He kept his notebook until just a few days before he died. During his last note, which he was dictating, he was reassuringly told, "Don't hurry." His response was, "I have to." In his final years, Bell suffered from diabetes. He died August 2nd, 1922, at the age of 75. In honor of his passing, all telephone service in the United States was stopped for 1 minute. Bell was buried in a grave blasted out of the rock in Nova Scotia. The engraving on his tomb, which he wrote himself, says simply, "Citizen of the United States and teacher of the deaf." At the time of his death, Mabel Bell said she didn't think she could live without him. Her words were prophetic. Mabel died only 5 months later and was buried beside him. Of all the many contributions he made, and in spite of the fact that he himself took most pride in his work with the deaf, Alexander Graham Bell is still known the world over for his invention of the telephone. Today there are well over 200 million telephones in the United States alone, and 92% of America's homes have at least one. The invention of the telephone was a long, arduous process that is testament to the determination and commitment of its inventor and his assistant. It required many years of labor, during which Bell suffered anguish and frustration he could barely describe. There were nights without sleep, endless obstacles and setbacks, failed experiments, poverty, physical collapse, and opposition and ridicule from critics. Through it all, Bell and Watson persevered. Bell had started out this process by working with the harmonic telegraph he developed for sending several telegraph messages at once. The telegraph used a group of different reeds that could transmit different vibrations. Bell felt it should be possible to pick up all the sounds of the human voice on these reeds. The first breakthrough came on June 2nd, 1875, when one of the metal reeds of the harmonic telegraph stuck. Bell's assistant, Thomas A. Watson, plucked the reed to loosen it. Bell, who was in another room, heard the sound transported over the wire in his receiver. He realized that the vibrations of the reed had caused variations of electric current. In turn, the electric current had reproduced the same variations in the receiver he was using. He raced out into the hall, shouting, "Watson, what did you do just then? Don't change anything." They spent the next hour or so plucking reeds and listening to the sounds that carried over the wires to the receiver. Bell then gave Watson instructions for improving the instrument. The new instrument could send voice sounds, but not words, All summer, Bell and Watson continued their experiments. Bell wrote at the time, "I am now beginning to realize the cares and anxieties of being an inventor. Flesh and blood could not stand much longer such a strain as I have had upon me." Finally, in September, Bell began to write out his first telephone patent. The work all summer had been so exhausting that Bell suffered a physical collapse and had to retreat to his parents' home in Canada. He returned to Boston refreshed and full of new ideas and got back to work. Patent number 174,465 was issued in 1876, when Bell was 29 years old. It was a general patent that covered the method of an apparatus for transmitting vocal or other sounds telegraphically by causing electrical undulations similar in form to the vibrations of the air accompanying the said vocal or other sounds. It was only 3 days later that one of the most memorable moments in modern history occurred, and it occurred mostly by accident. Bell and Watson were in different rooms, about to try out a new transmitter Bell had described in his patent. The legend is that Bell knocked over some battery acid, and it spilled onto his clothes. He yelled, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." And Watson, who was down at the end of the hall in a closed room, heard him. He heard him because Bell had just spoken the very first words ever to be transmitted electrically across wires. Today there's still doubt about whether the part about the battery acid is true. Neither Bell nor Watson ever mentioned it in their records of the event. Later the two would also get into a friendly squabble over what exact words were spoken across the wires that day. Watson said it was, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you," while Bell claimed it was, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." But the point, of course, is that something was said, and more importantly, something was heard. Alexander Graham Bell had invented the first successful telephone. The basic principles on which Bell's telephone worked are not so very different from the ones used by the telephone of today. His telephone consisted of a small microphone or transmitter located in a mouthpiece into which a person spoke. It also had a small loudspeaker or receiver in the earpiece, all powered by an electrical circuit. Here's how it works. When a person speaks into the mouthpiece, the sound waves generated by the voice are carried in the form of vibrations to a diaphragm in the mouthpiece. These sound vibrations make the diaphragm vibrate in and out, causing the electrical current running through the transmitter to vary in proportion to the sound, creating an electrical representation of the voice. The resulting electrical signal travels from the mouthpiece through a wire to the distant receiver. At the receiving end, the incoming electrical signal causes an electromagnet in the receiver to pull on a diaphragm. The movements of the diaphragm set up waves in the air immediately surrounding it. The diaphragm vibrates at the same frequency as the sender's voice, reproducing the voice in the speaker. Bell's invention was shortly expanded from a call from one room to another room in a house to calls of greater distances. In August of 1876, Bell received the first one-way long-distance call. This call came over an 8-mile telegraph line between Brantford, Ontario, Canada, and Paris, Ontario, Canada. Then, 2 months later, Bell and Watson held the first two-way long-distance telephone conversation. They spoke between Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, a distance of 2 miles. With the telephone completed and on its way to the mass market, Bell turned again to his work with the deaf. But even while he continued to make enormous contribution in fields of speech and hearing impairments, Bell was still always tinkering away at something in his lab. During these years, he developed a method for locating icebergs with the use of echoes. He worked on a technique for extracting water from vapor for people who were adrift at sea. And for 30 years, he tried to develop a breed of sheep that could bear more than one lamb at a time. As in the case of President Garfield, Bell had a special ability to transform apparent tragedies into an opportunity to serve humanity. In 1881, when Mabel gave birth to a premature baby who died within a few days of lung problems, Bell invented what he called a vacuum jacket. It was an airtight cylinder that breathed artificially for patients unable to do so on their own. The vacuum jacket was a precursor of the iron lung later developed to help polio victims. An inventor, said Bell, is a man who looks around the world and is not contented with things the way they are. He wants to improve whatever he sees. He wants to benefit the world. Perhaps Bell's greatest fun in later life was his interest in flying. Always generous with his money, he funded scientist Samuel Langley in his experiments with heavier-than-air machines. He himself conducted experiments with kites strong enough to lift people in the air. And in 1907, when he was 60 years old, Bell helped his wife Mabel Hubbard organize the Aerial Experiment Association, which worked to advance the field of aviation. It was the first research organization established and endowed by a woman. Bell was always a staunch supporter of women's rights and believed firmly that all people, no matter what gender, race, or creed, were entitled to vote. The Aerial Association developed the hydrofoil, a new form of speedboat that set a world record in 1919 of 71 miles per hour. The hydrofoil was Bell's last patent, filed in 1922, almost half a century after his first patent for the telephone. The principles of the hydrofoil are still being used today. The contributions of Alexander Graham Bell were numerous and involved many fields of human endeavor and struggle. Yet he would not agree with the world's assessment of his achievements. Bell is a rarity in the history of inventors, in that the inventions for which he was most acclaimed are those that meant the least to him. To Bell, his greatest work was his teaching, and the ability he had to help those who couldn't hear learn to speak. In his essence, Bell was a man enchanted by the human voice, by the beauty of music and sounds, and by the uniquely human ability of communication through words. Our unit of measurement for sound, the decibel, was named in tribute to his respect and contributions to that field. Bell, like most inventors, had a healthy amount of ambition, a certain stubbornness and will, and an ability to persevere through opposition and to transform failures into successes. But these were not the qualities that propelled him or defined him, or that ultimately led to success. What fueled Alexander Graham Bell was a limitless compassion for the handicapped and a burning desire to help them. Although he had a brilliant and creative mind, he was one inventor whose mind worked in service to the heart.